16 years ago, on a rain-soaked October night in Portland, Oregon, 28-year-old Sandra Martin finished her late shift at Murphy's Diner and walked into the darkness, never to be seen alive again. Her small blue sedan vanished with her, leaving behind only questions and a mother's unshakable faith. Police suspected abduction, but with no witnesses, and the forensic limitations of 2007, leads evaporated like morning mist over the Willamette River. Yet Ruth Martin refused to surrender hope, keeping her porch light burning every single night for 16 years, a beacon calling her daughter home. Then modern DNA analysis breathed life into forgotten evidence, and a single overlooked detail from that terrible night finally revealed the truth, exposing a betrayal that would shatter Portland's sense of safety forever. Before we dive into this shocking story, let us know where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more true crime documentaries. The neon lights of Murphy's Diner were still glowing against the October darkness when Sandra Martin clocked out at 11:47 p.m. on October 12, 2007. Portland's autumn chill had settled deep into the streets, and a fine mist clung to the lampposts like ghostly fingers. Red and gold leaves, slick with evening rain, carpeted the sidewalks in a patchwork of fallen beauty. Sandra pulled her wool coat tighter as she stepped through the diner's glass doors, the warmth of the kitchen still radiating from her uniform. At 28, Sandra Martin embodied the kind of determined optimism that made her beloved by both customers and coworkers. Her laugh could cut through the dinner rush chaos, and her smile had a way of making even the grumpiest patron feel welcome. She'd been saving every tip, every overtime hour, working toward her dream of graduate school and social work. "I want to help people," she'd told her mother Ruth countless times. "Really help them, not just serve them coffee." That night, Sandra moved through her closing routine with practiced efficiency. She wiped down tables, counted the register, and chatted with her coworker, Jenny Morrison, about weekend plans. "I'm finally going to tackle that hiking trail up Mount Hood," Sandra had said, her eyes bright with anticipation. "Been promising myself all summer." Jenny watched Sandra gather her purse and keys, the same ritual they'd shared hundreds of times. She waved from the door. Jenny would later recall, her voice breaking. "See you Monday, Jen." She always called me Jen. Nobody thought that would be the last time any of us would hear her voice. The security camera footage from 2007 was grainy at best. A pixelated ghost of Sandra's blue Honda Civic, pulling out of the diner's parking lot at 11:52 p.m. The 10-minute drive to her apartment on Southeast Belmont should have been routine. Sandra had made that journey countless times, past the familiar coffee shops and vintage stores that gave her neighborhood its character. But Sandra Martin never arrived home that night. 10 miles away, Ruth Martin sat in her living room armchair, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands. She'd developed a habit of staying up until Sandra came home from late shifts. Not out of worry, but out of love. Those few minutes of mother-daughter conversation before bed had become precious to both women. By 12:30 a.m., Ruth felt the first flutter of concern. Sandra was punctual by nature, almost obsessively so. By 4:00 a.m., concern had hardened into fear. "I left the porch light on, like always," Ruth would later say, her voice steady despite the tears. But that night, something felt different. A mother knows. "I called her phone over and over, but it just rang and rang." The October wind rattled the windows of Ruth's modest home as she paced the living room, Sandra's phone going straight to voicemail with each attempt. The recorded message, Sandra's cheerful voice saying, "You've reached Sandy. Leave me something good," became a cruel taunt in the growing darkness. At 2:15 a.m., Ruth Martin made the call that would change everything. Her voice shook as she spoke to the 911 dispatcher. "My daughter should have been home hours ago. Something's wrong. Something's very wrong." The porch light blazed against the Portland night, casting its golden glow across the empty driveway where Sandra's car should have been. Ruth stood at her window, watching the street for headlights that would never come, while somewhere in the darkness, a daughter's life hung in the balance, and a family's world began to crumble. Dawn crept over Portland on October 13th like a reluctant witness, painting the sky in shades of gray that matched the growing dread in Ruth Martin's heart. She hadn't slept, Hadn't even sat down since making that terrible phone call to The porch light still burned, now competing with the pale morning sun, as police officers gathered in her living room with notebooks and grim expressions. Officer Patricia Hayes, a 15-year veteran of missing persons cases, recognized the signs immediately. "Mrs. Martin," she said gently, settling into the chair across from Ruth, "walk me through Sandra's routine one more time. Every detail matters now." Ruth's hands trembled as she described Sandra's predictable schedule: work, home, study sessions for her LSAT prep course. "She's saving for law school," Ruth explained, her voice catching. "Every penny matters to her. She wouldn't just disappear." Within hours, Sandra's absence triggered a cascade of increasingly desperate discoveries. Her phone had gone straight to voicemail since midnight, unusual for someone who typically responded to texts within minutes. Her bank cards showed no activity after her last purchase at Murphy's Diner, a bottle of water and a granola bar for the drive home. Detective Marcus Webb, assigned to the case that gray October morning, found himself facing the kind of puzzle that made seasoned investigators lose sleep. At first glance, he later recalled, it looked like maybe she'd left on her own. Young woman, saving money, maybe stressed about school. But that theory fell apart fast. Sandra's apartment told a different story entirely. Her bed was still made from the morning before, textbooks spread across her desk, exactly where she'd left them. Her LSAT study guide lay open to page 24T7, highlighting visible in the margins. The coffee maker was programmed for 6:30 a.m., ready to brew Sandra's morning cup. Everything was waiting for her to come home, Ruth whispered as they walked through the small space. Even her goldfish was expecting breakfast. The investigation machinery ground into motion, with the efficiency of a department that had handled too many cases like this. Detective Webb coordinated with local precincts, expanding the search radius beyond Sandra's usual routes. Her photograph, a radiant smile from her last birthday party, began appearing on patrol car dashboards and precinct bulletin boards throughout the Portland metropolitan area. Jenny Morrison arrived at the police station that afternoon, still wearing her Murphy's Diner uniform, her eyes red from crying. Sandra was excited about something, she told Detective Webb, searching her memory for any detail that might help. She'd been talking about finally having enough money saved up. She was so close to her goal. The first canvass of Sandra's neighborhood yielded frustrating fragments. A neighbor thought they'd heard a car engine around midnight, but couldn't be sure. Another resident mentioned seeing unfamiliar headlights, but the description was too vague to be useful. Portland's October rain had washed away any potential tire tracks or footprints that might have provided clues. By evening, volunteer search teams had formed organically throughout the city. Sandra's photograph was photocopied hundreds of times, her smiling face soon taped to telephone poles, coffee shop windows, and community center bulletin boards. Missing Sandra Martin, 28, last seen leaving Murphy's Diner on October 20. Ruth Martin stood on her front porch as darkness fell again, watching volunteers organize search parties under the streetlights. The same porch light that had welcomed Sandra home countless times now served as a beacon of hope and desperation. "She'll see it," Ruth told anyone who would listen. "When she comes home, she'll see the light." Detective Webb reviewed the case file as the second night without Sandra began. No witnesses to an abduction, no signs of struggle at her workplace or apartment, no angry ex-boyfriends or threatening encounters. Sandra Martin had simply vanished into the Portland night, leaving behind only questions and a mother's growing anguish. The October wind carried the first hints of winter as it rattled through the empty streets. Somewhere in the darkness, Sandra's blue Honda Civic had disappeared, as completely as its driver, and time was already becoming the investigation's most ruthless enemy. The following week transformed Portland's landscape into a massive search operation. Detective Webb coordinated teams that spread across the city like a determined grid, methodically combing through every location where Sandra Martin might have ended up, voluntarily or otherwise. The Willamette River became a particular focus, its dark waters holding secrets that dive teams worked tirelessly to uncover. K-9 units arrived from neighboring counties, their handlers guiding German shepherds and bloodhounds through Forest Park's 5,000 acres of dense woodland. The dogs picked up scent trails that led nowhere, their eager noses following phantom paths that ended at parking lots and bus stops, leaving investigators more frustrated than before. Captain Sarah Chen, overseeing the multi-agency response, held daily briefings in the precinct's largest conference room. Maps covered every available wall surface, marked with colored pins representing search areas, potential sightings, and dead ends. Every hour that passes reduces our chances, she told the assembled team on day 5. But we're not giving up. Sandra Martin deserves better than that. The Portland Police Bureau's dive team arrived at the Willamette River before dawn on October 18. Detective Maria Santos, certified in underwater recovery operations, suited up in the cold darkness while her colleagues set up portable floodlights along the riverbank. The water was murky with autumn runoff, visibility limited to arm's length even with high-powered underwater cameras. The river doesn't give up its secrets easily, Santos explained to worried family members gathered on the shore. But if Sandra's car went in here, we'll find it. For 3 days, divers methodically searched the most likely entry points, boat ramps, and secluded areas where a vehicle could have been pushed into the water without witnesses. Ruth Martin attended every dive operation, her presence both heartbreaking and inspiring to the search teams. She brought coffee and sandwiches, transforming grief into action, refusing to accept the passive role of waiting victims' family. Sandra would do the same for any one of us, she told reporters who gathered to document the massive effort. This community takes care of its own. The press conference on October 20th drew media attention from across the Pacific Northwest. Detective Webb faced a room full of cameras and microphones, Sandra's photograph displayed on easels behind him. Sandra Martin is a beloved member of our community, he stated firmly. We're treating this as an active missing person case with possible foul play involved. We're exhausting every lead, following every tip. Tips poured into the police hotline by the dozens, concerned citizens reporting suspicious vehicles, unusual behavior, half-remembered encounters from the night Sandra disappeared. Each call was logged, prioritized, and investigated by teams of detectives who worked 16-hour shifts, fueled by coffee and determination. One tip seemed promising initially. A gas station attendant reported serving a young woman matching Sandra's description around 1 a.m. on October 13th, but security footage revealed the customer to be someone else entirely, another false hope in a growing collection of dead ends. The cadaver dogs brought in from the Oregon State Police proved both a blessing and a curse. Trained to detect human remains, they alerted several locations throughout the search area: an abandoned warehouse in southeast Portland, a construction site near the river, a secluded area of Mount Tabor Park. Each alert triggered intensive excavation efforts that yielded nothing but disappointment and exhausted searchers. Search and Rescue Coordinator Jim Walsh had participated in hundreds of missing person cases over his 20-year career, but Sandra's disappearance struck him differently. "Usually we find something," he confided to Detective Webb during a break in the forest search. "A piece clothing, personal effects, some kind of trail. This is like she vanished into thin air." The helicopter searches proved equally fruitless. Pilots from the Portland Police Air Support Unit flew grid patterns over the Columbia River Gorge, their thermal imaging cameras scanning for heat signatures or vehicle wreckage hidden beneath the forest canopy. Hours of footage revealed wildlife, hikers, and abandoned camping equipment, but nothing connected to Sandra Martin. As October faded into November, the massive search effort began to show signs of strain. Volunteer numbers dwindled as initial enthusiasm gave way to the reality of a complex investigation. Professional search teams continued their methodical work, but leads were becoming increasingly rare and less promising. Detective Webb reviewed the case files each night, searching for patterns or overlooked details that might break the investigation open. Sandra's life seemed almost impossibly normal. Work, family, school preparations, a small circle of close friends, no enemies, no dangerous relationships, no risky behaviors that might explain her disappearance. The absence of Sandra's car remained the most puzzling element. Unlike a person who might choose to disappear, A vehicle couldn't simply vanish without leaving some trace. Yet despite extensive searches of parking garages, remote areas, and waterways, the blue Honda Civic remained as elusive as its owner, a ghost car that had seemingly evaporated into the Portland night. Portland's coffee shops, churches, and neighborhood gathering places became impromptu headquarters for a community determined to find Sandra Martin. Murphy's Diner, where Sandra had worked her final shift, transformed into an unofficial coordination center where volunteers organized search parties and shared information over endless cups of coffee and growing anxiety. The morning regulars at Murphy's, construction workers, early commuters, and night shift nurses, ending their rounds, found themselves unexpectedly united by Sandra's absence. She knew everyone's order by heart, recalled Tom Patterson, electrician who'd been coming to the diner for 5 years. Made you feel like family. When someone like that just vanishes, it shakes your whole world. Pastor Michael Rivera of St. Anthony's Catholic Church, where Ruth Martin attended weekly mass, opened the parish hall for volunteer coordination meetings. The basement room, usually reserved for bingo nights and youth group activities, now hosted determined neighbors huddled over maps and missing person flyers. "This doesn't happen here," Rivera told his congregation during Sunday service. "At least we thought it didn't." Sandra's disappearance is forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about our community's safety. The tips flooding into the police hotline painted a picture of a city on edge, suddenly aware of shadows and possibilities they'd previously ignored. Margaret Chen, a librarian at the Southeast Portland branch where Sandra occasionally studied, reported seeing a young woman arguing with a man near the library's parking lot around the time Sandra disappeared. But the description was vague. Average height, dark jacket, seemed angry, and security cameras had malfunctioned that week. Detective Webb found himself chasing increasingly desperate leads as public pressure mounted. A homeless man claimed to have witnessed an abduction near the river, but his story changed with each telling, details shifting like smoke. A convenience store clerk swore Sandra had come in for gas the night after she disappeared, but couldn't explain why security footage showed no such transaction. The theory of an abusive ex-boyfriend gained traction among community members, despite Sandra's friends insisting she hadn't dated anyone seriously in over a year. "People want someone to blame," explained Dr. Patricia Moore, a criminal psychology professor at Portland State University, who'd been following the case. "When a young woman disappears, society immediately looks for a romantic relationship gone wrong. It's easier than accepting random violence." Sandra's co-workers at Murphy's Diner became amateur detectives, analyzing every customer interaction they could remember from her final weeks. Jenny Morrison kept a notebook of suspicious encounters, strange phone calls, and unusual behavior from regular customers. "There was this guy who came in sometimes," she told Detective Webb during her third interview. "Always sat in Sandra's section, always paid in cash, gave me the creeps, but Sandra said he was harmless." The mysterious cash-paying customer became a focus of intense investigation. Described as middle-aged with graying hair and calloused hands, he'd been a semi-regular at Murphy's for months, but hadn't been seen since Sandra's disappearance. Restaurant security footage was too grainy to provide clear identification, and no one could remember his name or vehicle. Local media coverage intensified community anxiety, while simultaneously keeping Sandra's case in the public eye. Channel 8's Evening News featured nightly updates, interviewing family members, search volunteers, and law enforcement officials. Reporter Jessica Walsh became the unofficial voice of the investigation, her empathetic coverage earning trust from both the Martin family and investigating officers. "Fear changes a community," Walsh observed during a live broadcast from Sandra's neighborhood. "Women are walking in groups now, looking over their shoulders. Parents are driving teenagers to work instead of letting them walk. Everyone's wondering if it happened to Sandra, could it happen to anyone?" The geographic profile of tips revealed interesting patterns. Most sightings clustered around Southeast Portland, Sandra's familiar territory of home, work, and school. But scattered reports placed her as far away as Seattle, Vancouver, and even California. Desperate hope masquerading as reliable information. Social media, still in its relative infancy in 2007, became a powerful tool for spreading awareness. Sandra's photographs circulated through MySpace profiles and early Facebook accounts, shared by friends of friends until her image reached thousands of strangers who felt compelled to help search for someone they'd never met. The reward fund, started by Ruth Martin with her modest savings, grew through community donations to $15,000 within 2 weeks. Local businesses contributed services, free printing for missing person flyers, donated food for search volunteers, vehicle maintenance for police units working overtime on the case. Yet despite the community's unprecedented mobilization, solid leads remained frustratingly elusive. Tips that seemed promising upon initial report invariably crumbled under investigation. Witnesses recanted statements, timelines proved impossible, and alleged sightings turned out to be cases of mistaken identity. Detective Webb worked 18-hour days, following every lead regardless of how unlikely it seemed. His caseboard grew into a complex web of red string connecting photographs, statements, and potential evidence, a visual representation of an investigation that was generating plenty of activity, but precious little progress toward finding Sandra Martin. The October rain continued to fall, washing away potential evidence and hope in equal measure, while somewhere in Portland's sprawling urban landscape, the answers to Sandra's disappearance remained hidden in shadows that seemed determined to keep their secrets. The Portland Police Bureau's conference room took on the appearance of a war room as October melted into November. Detective Webb's caseboard had evolved into a sprawling maze of photographs, witness statements, and timeline reconstructions that seemed to lead everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The sheer volume of tips and potential leads had created its own organizational nightmare, requiring additional clerical staff just to manage the paperwork. We had hundreds of man-hours invested and nothing concrete to show for it, Webb later recalled, exhaustion evident in his voice even years afterward. Every lead we chased turned into smoke. Every witness statement fell apart under scrutiny. It was like Sandra had been erased from existence. The forensic challenges proved equally frustrating. In 2007, DNA technology existed, but lacked the sophisticated analysis capabilities that would later revolutionize cold cases. The trace evidence collected from Murphy's Diner parking lot, cigarette butts, fast food wrappers, unidentified fibers, yielded inconclusive results that couldn't definitively connect to Sandra or her disappearance. Crime scene technician Beverly Foster spent countless hours processing Sandra's Honda Civic's usual parking spots, searching for tire impressions, fluid leaks, or any physical evidence that might indicate struggle or abduction. The October rain worked against us, she explained. Any evidence that might have existed was washed away within hours of Sandra's disappearance. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts painted a picture that offered little comfort to investigators. If this was a stranger abduction, Special Agent Robert Clark concluded, the perpetrator likely had experience and planning capability. The complete absence of evidence suggests someone familiar with law enforcement procedures and forensic detection methods. Ruth Martin's daily visits to the police station became both heartbreaking and motivating for the investigative team. She arrived each morning with fresh coffee and homemade cookies, transforming the sterile conference room into something resembling a family kitchen, while she reviewed case updates and offered suggestions born from a mother's desperate logic. Mrs. Martin never accused us of not working hard enough, Detective Santos remembered, but her presence was a constant reminder of what was at stake. Every dead end felt like a personal failure when Sandra's mother was sitting right there, still believing we could bring her daughter home. The technological limitations of 2007 became increasingly apparent as the investigation progressed. Cell phone tracking required court orders and yielded only approximate locations. Security camera footage from businesses along Sandra's route home was either non-existent or too poor quality to provide useful information. GPS tracking in civilian vehicles was rare, eliminating one potential source of Sandra's final movements. Detective Webb found himself managing an investigation that was simultaneously too complex and frustratingly simple. We had no shortage of theories, he explained. Stranger abduction, acquaintance assault, voluntary disappearance, accident followed by panic, but theories without evidence are just educated guessing. The media attention that had initially energized the search effort began creating its own complications. False confessions arrived weekly. Disturbed individuals, seeking attention, who claimed responsibility for Sandra's disappearance. Each confession required investigation, consuming valuable resources that might have been better used elsewhere. Anonymous tips became increasingly bizarre as the case gained notoriety. Callers reported Sandra being held in basement dungeons, sold into human trafficking, or killed in occult rituals. Every tip, regardless of how outlandish, received initial investigation, a protocol that stretched department resources to their breaking point. The absence of Sandra's car remained the investigation's most confounding element. Detective Webb coordinated with agencies throughout Oregon, Washington, and Northern California, distributing the vehicle's license plate number and description to every patrol unit and parking enforcement officer in the region. Months passed without a single confirmed sighting. A person can disappear, Webb explained to frustrated family members during yet another update meeting. People have resources, can make decisions, can hide or be hidden, but cars get towed, ticketed, noticed by neighbors. Cars break down and get abandoned. The fact that we can't find Sandra's vehicle is almost more troubling than not finding Sandra herself. Internal pressure within the Portland Police Bureau grew as other cases demanded attention and resources. Captain Chen found herself defending the continued intensive investigation to superiors, who questioned the allocation of overtime hours and specialized personnel to a case that seemed to be generating more questions than answers. The seasonal change from autumn to winter brought new challenges. Outdoor search areas became increasingly difficult to access as rain turned to snow in the higher elevations. Volunteer searchers, sustained by initial enthusiasm and community support, gradually returned to their normal routines as weeks passed without breakthrough developments. By December, Detective Webb was forced to acknowledge what everyone feared but no one wanted to say aloud. Sandra Martin's case was going cold. Active daily investigation would necessarily be reduced, though the file would remain open and new leads would continue to be followed. Ruth Martin received this news in the same conference room where she'd brought coffee and cookies for 3 months of unsuccessful investigation. The porch light at her home had burned continuously since October 12th, a beacon that had called to empty streets and dark nights without success. I told them I understood, Ruth later recalled. But understanding and accepting are different things. I walked out of that police station knowing that everyone else was ready to move on. But I wasn't. I couldn't. Not while Sandra was still out there somewhere, waiting for me to find her. The Portland winter of 2007 settled over Ruth Martin's house like a heavy blanket, but the porch light continued its vigilant glow, cutting through rain, snow, and the growing darkness of unanswered questions. Inside, Sandra's room remained exactly as she'd left it. Textbooks open to studied pages, clothes hanging in the closet, a coffee mug still sitting on the nightstand with the faint ring of her last morning's drink. By early 2008, Detective Webb's active caseload had expanded to include 3 new missing persons and 2 homicides. Sandra's file moved to a metal cabinet designated for cold cases, though Webb made a personal promise to Ruth Martin that he would review the evidence monthly, searching for overlooked details or new technological approaches that might breathe life into the stagnant investigation. Time became my enemy, Ruth reflected years later, not just because it meant Sandra had been gone longer, but because people forget, witnesses move away, evidence degrades. The world keeps spinning while your daughter is frozen in time. Ruth developed rituals that helped her navigate the impossible landscape of indefinite grief. Every Sunday after church, she drove Sandra's usual route from Murphy's Diner to their home, timing the journey and studying the streets for anything that might have been missed. She kept Sandra's cell phone active, paying the monthly bill religiously, just in case her daughter somehow found a way to call. The annual vigils became focal points for Ruth's survival strategy. October 12, 2008, brought nearly 100 community members to Murphy's Diner parking lot, where they lit candles and shared memories of Sandra's infectious laugh and generous spirit. Local news covered the event, keeping Sandra's case in public consciousness even as new tragedies competed for attention. Jenny Morrison, Sandra's former co-worker, became an unexpected source of strength for Ruth. The two women met monthly for coffee, sharing stories about Sandra and theories about what might have happened. It helped to talk to someone who knew Sandra the way I did, Ruth explained. Someone who understood that she wasn't just a missing person, she was a real person with dreams and plans and people who loved her. The Missing Children and Adults Network became Ruth's introduction to a community she'd never wanted to join, families united by the terrible bond of unexplained disappearances. Support group meetings in church basements and community centers provided both comfort and heartbreak, as Ruth met parents, spouses, and siblings wrestling with similar unanswered questions. There's a special kind of hell reserved for families of the missing, explained Dr. Patricia Moore, who facilitated one of Portland's missing persons support groups. Families of murder victims have closure, terrible as it is. Families of the missing live in perpetual limbo, unable to grieve properly because hope and despair exist simultaneously. Ruth's advocacy work grew naturally from her personal pain. She lobbied the Oregon legislature for improved missing person protocols, better funding for search and rescue operations, and enhanced training for law enforcement officers handling disappearance cases. Sandra's law, passed in 2010, required faster activation of statewide alerts and established standardized procedures for multi-agency cooperation. The financial strain of maintaining hope proved unexpectedly crushing. Ruth continued paying for Sandra's health insurance, car registration, and apartment rent for 6 months after the disappearance, unable to accept that her daughter wouldn't return to reclaim her life. Credit card debt accumulated as Ruth hired private investigators and psychics, chasing any possibility that might succeed where official channels had failed. Sandra's birthday, March 15th, became an annual pilgrimage for Ruth and a small circle of dedicated friends. They gathered at Sandra's favorite restaurant, ordered her preferred meal, and toasted to hopes that felt increasingly fragile with each passing year. We celebrated her life, Ruth explained, because we couldn't bear to mourn her death, not when we didn't know for certain. The porch light became a neighborhood landmark, visible from several blocks away and recognized by postal workers, delivery drivers, and evening joggers as a symbol of unwavering maternal love. Neighbors occasionally approached Ruth to ask if she'd considered turning it off, gently suggesting that excessive hope might be preventing healthy healing. Ruth's response never varied. The light stays on until Sandra comes home or until I know she can't. Sleep became Ruth's greatest challenge. She developed insomnia that resisted medical intervention, spending nights researching missing person cases online, studying forensic advances, and corresponding with other families facing similar situations. The computer screen's glow competed with the porch light, two beacons of desperate activity in the dark hours when hope felt most fragile. By 2012, 5 years after Sandra's disappearance, Ruth had transformed from grieving mother into experienced advocate. She consulted with law enforcement agencies on missing person protocols, spoke at conferences about family support systems, and mentored newly devastated families entering the awful community of the missing. Yet despite her public strength and advocacy success, Ruth's private world remained frozen in October. Sandra's room stayed unchanged, the porch light burned through storms and clear nights alike, and every phone call still carried the possibility of being the one that would finally bring answers to a mother who refused to surrender hope. The investigation file gathered dust in its metal cabinet, occasionally reviewed by new detectives or revisited when similar cases emerged, but offering no new revelations to justify renewed active investigation. Sandra Martin had become a name on a list, a photograph in a database, a cold case waiting for the technological breakthrough or witness revelation that might never come. Portland evolved around Sandra Martin's absence, like a river flowing around a stone. New restaurants opened on the streets she used to walk, young families moved into apartments she might have rented, and the city's landscape shifted, while her case remained suspended in investigative amber. Yet for those who remembered, Sandra's disappearance had permanently altered their relationship with their hometown's sense of safety. The Murphy's Diner, where Sandra worked her final shift, changed hands twice between 2010 and 2015, but each new owner inherited the shrine-like corner booth where regular customers still left flowers on October. Jenny Morrison, now the day shift manager, maintained Sandra's employee photograph on the staff bulletin board, a talisman against forgetting that drew curious questions from new hires who'd never heard the story. "You can't understand what it did to us," explained Tom Patterson, the electrician who'd been a regular customer during Sandra's time at the diner. "We thought we knew everyone, thought our neighborhood was safe. When Sandra vanished, it was like learning that monsters were real and they looked exactly like ordinary people." The demographic changes in Southeast Portland meant that by 2015, many residents had no knowledge of Sandra's case. Young professionals and students, drawn by the area's coffee culture and affordable rent, walked the same streets Sandra had traveled without awareness of the tragedy that had unfolded there. Missing person posters faded and were removed, replaced by advertisements for yoga classes and food trucks. Detective Webb, promoted to sergeant in 2012, watched newer officers handle missing person cases with procedures that had been strengthened by lessons learned from Sandra's investigation. Improved technology, faster response protocols, and enhanced interagency cooperation meant that cases like Sandra's were less likely to stagnate, but those improvements couldn't retroactively solve the mystery of what happened on October 20. The annual vigils continued but drew smaller crowds each year. Core supporters, Ruth Martin, Jenny Morrison, Detective Webb, and a handful of neighbors, maintained the tradition with stubborn dedication, but the broader community's attention had inevitably moved to more recent tragedies. Portland's steady stream of urban problems provided new causes for concern and activism. The silence became its own wound, observed Pastor Michael Rivera during his 2014 sermon on the anniversary of Sandra's disappearance. Not just Sandra's silence, but our collective silence about the questions her case raised. We stopped talking about personal safety, about looking out for our neighbors, about the responsibility we have for each other's well-being. The psychological impact on Sandra's close friends proved more lasting than anyone anticipated. Jenny Morrison entered therapy to deal with survivors' guilt and anxiety attacks, triggered by late-night shifts. Other Murphy's Diner employees from 2007 reported similar symptoms. Hyper-vigilant about personal safety, difficulty trusting new people, and a persistent sense that normalcy was an illusion that could be shattered at any moment. Ruth Martin's advocacy work had evolved into a second career by the mid-2010s. The nonprofit organization she founded, Sandra's Light Foundation, provided support services for families of missing persons throughout the Pacific Northwest. The foundation's offices, located just blocks from Murphy's Diner, served as both memorial to Sandra and resource center for other families facing similar nightmares. Ruth became the person other families called when their loved ones disappeared, explained social worker Maria Gonzalez, who worked with Sandra's Light Foundation. She understood the bureaucracy, knew which questions to ask, could translate police procedures into human language. Sandra's disappearance had trained her for a job no mother should have to learn. The case files from Sandra's investigation became a teaching tool at the Pacific Northwest Law Enforcement Academy, where Detective Webb occasionally lectured about cold case management and family relations during extended investigations. Sandra's story illustrated both the importance of thorough initial investigation and the harsh reality that some cases resist resolution despite best efforts. Technology continued advancing throughout the silent years. Social media platforms that hadn't existed in 2007 became tools for missing person awareness. Sandra's photograph appeared on Facebook memorial pages and Twitter campaigns, shared by strangers who felt compelled to keep her memory alive in digital spaces that might somehow generate new leads. The Portland Police Bureau's Cold Case Unit, established in 2013, inherited Sandra's file along with hundreds of other unsolved disappearances and homicides. Detective Sarah Chen, transferred from patrol to lead the new unit, found herself drawn to Sandra's case, despite having no personal connection to the investigation. Something about it felt solvable, she later explained. Not easy, but like there were answers waiting if we could just ask the right questions. By 2016, Nearly a decade had passed since Sandra's disappearance. The porch light at Ruth's house had become a neighborhood fixture, as permanent seeming as the streetlights and stop signs. New residents learned about the house with the light that never goes off from longtime neighbors, though many didn't know the story behind Ruth Martin's nighttime vigil. The absence of closure had created its own strange form of presence in the community. Sandra existed as memory, symbol, and cautionary tale, a reminder that ordinary evenings could become extraordinary tragedies, that safety was provisional, and that some questions might never receive answers, no matter how desperately they were sought. The silence surrounding Sandra's fate had become a community burden, carried differently by different people but shared by all who remembered her laugh, her ambition, and her simple plan to drive home after work on an October night that changed everything for everyone who loved her. The Portland Police Bureau's cold case unit occupied a renovated section of the precinct's basement, where fluorescent lights hummed over metal filing cabinets containing decades of unsolved mysteries. Detective Sarah Chen had inherited Sandra Martin's case in 2016, along with 47 other cold files that represented years of investigative dead ends and family heartbreak. But by 2022, the technological landscape had transformed in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to Detective Webb's original investigation team. The breakthrough began with a routine evidence review mandated by the department's new cold case protocols. Every unsolved case older than 10 years required complete re-examination, using modern forensic techniques unavailable during the original investigation. Sandra's evidence box, sealed and stored since 2008, contained trace materials that had been insufficient for 2007's DNA analysis capabilities, but potentially rich with information for 2022's advanced genetic profiling systems. Forensic technician Dr. Amanda Foster opened Sandra's evidence box on a rain-soaked Tuesday morning in March, the kind of Portland weather that seemed appropriate for revisiting old tragedies. Inside, carefully cataloged and preserved, were the cigarette butts collected from Murphy's Diner parking lot, fiber samples from Sandra's car's usual parking space, and a single piece of evidence that had been dismissed as irrelevant 15 years earlier, a discarded coffee cup found near the diner's rear entrance. "We can do now what was impossible in 2007, Dr. Foster explained to Detective Chen as they reviewed the evidence inventory. Touch DNA recovery, advanced STR profiling, genealogical database comparison, tools that can extract genetic information from samples we couldn't even process back then." The Oregon State Crime Lab had undergone revolutionary changes since Sandra's disappearance. Equipment that required samples the size of a quarter in 2007 could now extract DNA profiles from microscopic traces, invisible to the naked eye. The combined DNA index system, CADIS database, had expanded exponentially, containing genetic profiles from millions of individuals convicted of various crimes across the United States. Detective Chen submitted Sandra's evidence for reprocessing on March 15, 2022, Sandra's birthday, a coincidence that felt significant to Ruth Martin when she learned about it weeks later. The advanced analysis revealed partial DNA profiles on 2 of the cigarette butts and a more complete genetic signature on the coffee cup that had been overlooked during the original investigation. The initial database searches yielded no direct matches in CODIS, but the genetic profiles were sufficient for genealogical analysis, an investigative technique that had emerged in the 2010s and proven remarkably successful in solving decades-old cold cases. By comparing crime scene DNA to publicly available genetic databases used for ancestry research, investigators could identify potential relatives of unknown suspects and work backward through family trees to find possible perpetrators. Genetic genealogist Patricia Williams, contracted by the Portland Police Bureau for cold case analysis, received Sandra's DNA profiles. In April, Williams had helped solve over 30 cold cases using genealogical techniques, including several high-profile murders that had confounded investigators for decades. Sandra's case presented unique challenges. The DNA evidence was limited and potentially degraded, but Williams was optimistic about finding useful family connections. Genealogical investigation is like detective work in reverse. Williams explained during her initial consultation with Detective Chen. Instead of starting with a suspect and building a case, we start with DNA and build a family tree until we find someone who could have been at your crime scene. The process required weeks of painstaking analysis. Williams uploaded Sandra's unknown DNA profiles to GEDmatch, a genealogical database containing genetic information from over 1 million users who had submitted their data for ancestry research. The system identified potential relatives, third cousins, fourth cousins, and other distant family connections that shared genetic markers with Sandra's unknown subject. Building family trees from these distant connections involved extensive research through public records, obituaries, census data, and social media profiles. Williams constructed elaborate genealogical charts that traced family lines forward and backward through generations, searching for individuals who would have been in Portland during October 2007 and fit the general profile of Sandra's potential abductor. By June 2022, Williams had identified a cluster of genetic relatives centered around a family with deep roots in the Portland area. The family tree analysis pointed to several possible suspects, but one name stood out with chilling clarity: David Raymond Kowalski, a 52-year-old maintenance supervisor who had lived in Southeast Portland for over 20 years. Detective Chen felt her pulse quicken as she reviewed Kowalski's background information. He worked for Portland Public Schools, maintaining buildings throughout the district, including several locations within miles of Murphy's Diner. His employment record showed he typically worked evening shifts, finishing around the time Sandra would have been driving home. Most significantly, Kowalski had been a semi-regular customer at Murphy's Diner during the months leading up to Sandra's disappearance. The genealogical evidence was compelling but not conclusive, Detective Chen later explained. We needed direct DNA confirmation to move forward with an arrest. The challenge was obtaining a comparison sample from Kowalski without alerting him to the investigation or violating his constitutional rights. The surveillance team assigned to Kowalski documented his daily routines while searching for opportunities to collect discarded DNA evidence. After 3 weeks of careful observation, they recovered a coffee cup and cigarette butts from a construction site where Kowalski was supervising weekend repair work. Dr. Foster's analysis confirmed what Detective Chen had hoped and feared. David Kowalski's DNA matched the genetic profile found on evidence from Sandra Martin's case. After 15 years of silence, Sandra's disappearance finally had a name attached to it, a name that would soon shatter Portland's sense of trust and expose the terrifying reality that monsters sometimes hide behind the most ordinary faces. The Portland Police Bureau's interrogation room felt smaller than usual, as Detective Chen reviewed David Raymond Kowalski's file one final time before the confrontation that would either solve Sandra Martin's case or prove that genealogical DNA analysis had led them down another dead end. Kowalski sat across the metal table, his work-worn hands folded calmly, his expression suggesting mild confusion about why he'd been asked to come to the station for questioning. At 52, David Kowalski embodied the invisible reliability that made him valuable to Portland Public Schools and trusted by the community. For 23 years, he'd maintained heating systems, repaired broken windows, and ensured that children attended classes in safe, comfortable buildings. Colleagues described him as quiet but helpful, someone who arrived early and stayed late, who knew every principal and janitor in the district. "Mr. Kowalski," Detective Chen began, her voice carefully neutral despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "We're investigating some incidents from 2007, and we believe you might have information that could help us." She placed Sandra's photograph on the table between them, watching Kowalski's reaction carefully. Kowalski's face registered what appeared to be genuine recognition, followed by appropriate sadness. "That's the waitress from Murphy's Diner," he said quietly. "Sandra something. She disappeared, right? Terrible thing. I remember the search parties, all the police activity. Never did find out what happened to her." The response was so perfectly normal, so appropriately concerned, that Detective Chen felt a moment's doubt about the DNA evidence that had led them to this moment. But forensic science didn't lie, even when human behavior proved confusing. Kowalski's genetic material had been found at the scene of Sandra's disappearance, a fact that demanded explanation regardless of how ordinary he seemed. "You ate at Murphy's Diner regularly around that time," Chen continued, consulting her notes. "The staff remember you as a semi-regular customer, usually ordering coffee and pie, always paying in cash." Kowalski nodded without hesitation. "I worked a lot of evening shifts back then. Murphy's stayed open late. Good coffee, quiet place to unwind before heading home. Sandra was one of the waitresses there. Nice girl, always friendly, never rushed you even when they were busy." The casual familiarity with Sandra's personality struck Chen as significant. Kowalski hadn't just been a customer, he'd been observant enough to form opinions about Sandra's character and work habits. In missing person cases involving stranger abduction, perpetrators often displayed unusual interest in their eventual victims' routines and personalities. "Do you remember the night Sandra disappeared? October 12, 2007. Chen asked, leaning forward slightly. "Were you at Murphy's that evening?" For the first time, Kowalski hesitated. The pause lasted only seconds, but Chen had interviewed enough suspects to recognize the mental calculation happening behind his eyes. "That was 15 years ago," he said finally. "I can't remember specific nights from that long ago. Might have been, might not have been." The DNA evidence gave Chen leverage that Detective Webb had never possessed during the original investigation. "Mr. Kowalski, we've been able to process evidence from Sandra's case using modern forensic techniques that weren't available until your DNA was found on items collected from the Murphy's Diner parking lot on the night Sandra disappeared." Kowalski's expression didn't change dramatically. No sudden confession or dramatic breakdown that television crime shows might suggest. Instead, his face hardened slightly, the friendly confusion replaced by something more calculating. "I was a customer there," he said carefully. "Of course my DNA might be in the parking lot. I probably threw away cigarette butts, coffee cups, all sorts of things over the months I ate there." The response demonstrated legal sophistication that surprised Chen. Kowalski understood that DNA evidence alone might not be sufficient for conviction, that his presence at Murphy's Diner was established and could explain genetic traces in the area. But Chen had more than just DNA. She had genealogical analysis that had led them directly to him, and she had 15 years of investigative experience that told her when someone was hiding crucial information. The DNA was found on evidence specifically associated with the night Sandra disappeared. Chen explained, watching Kowalski's reaction carefully. "Not just any night, but that specific evening. Can you explain how your genetic material ended up connected to the time frame of Sandra's disappearance?" The interrogation continued for 3 hours, with Kowalski maintaining his position that any DNA evidence could be explained by his regular patronage of Murphy's Diner. He requested a lawyer after the first hour, effectively ending direct questioning, but his demeanor during those initial interviews provided Chen with valuable insights into his personality and potential involvement. While Kowalski consulted with his attorney, Chen's team executed search warrants for his home and vehicle. The search of his modest Southeast Portland house revealed a meticulously organized living space that suggested obsessive attention to detail. More significantly, they discovered a collection of newspaper clippings about Sandra's case, carefully preserved in a scrapbook that also contained articles about other missing women throughout the Pacific Northwest. The search team's most chilling discovery was hidden in Kowalski's garage workshop. A detailed map of Southeast Portland, with Murphy's Diner marked in red, along with Sandra's apartment building, her usual rot home, and several other locations significant to her daily routine. The map appeared to have been created well before Sandra's disappearance, suggesting premeditation and planning that elevated the case from potential accident or crime of opportunity to calculated predatory behavior. Detective Chen reviewed the evidence as Kowalski was formally arrested and charged with Sandra Martin's murder. After 15 years of silence, Sandra's case finally had a suspect, a trusted community member whose ordinary exterior had concealed disturbing obsessions and potentially deadly intentions. The arrest warrant detailed probable cause based on DNA evidence, genealogical analysis, and circumstantial evidence, discovered during the search of Kowalski's property. But Chen knew that arrests were only the beginning. Proving Kowalski's guilt beyond reasonable doubt would require building a case that could withstand the scrutiny of defense attorneys and skeptical jurors who might find it difficult to believe that such an ordinary-seeming man could be capable of such extraordinary evil. The pre-dawn arrest of David Kowalski on August 15, 2022, unfolded with the quiet efficiency that Portland police had learned from decades of high-profile cases. Detective Chen led a team of 6 officers to Kowalski's modest ranch house on Southeast Division Street, timing the operation for 5:30 a.m., when the suspect would be home, but neighbors less likely to witness the commotion that would soon engulf their peaceful residential block. Kowalski answered the door in pajamas and a bathrobe, his expression shifting from sleepy confusion to grim recognition, as Chen displayed the arrest warrant. "David Raymond Kowalski, you're under arrest for the murder of Sandra Martin," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of 15 years of investigative persistence, finally reaching resolution. The handcuffs clicked into place without resistance, Kowalski's compliance suggesting either innocence or the resignation of someone who'd been expecting this moment for years. As patrol units secured the scene, neighbors emerged from their homes in various states of undress, drawn by the flashing lights and official activity that had shattered their Monday morning routine. Margaret Henderson, who'd lived next door to Kowalski for 8 years, stood on her front porch in shock as she watched her quiet, helpful neighbor being loaded into a patrol car. "He fixed my fence last summer," she told reporters later that day. "Brought me soup when I was sick. This has to be some kind of mistake." The community reaction that followed Kowalski's arrest revealed the profound disruption that occurs when ordinary assumptions about safety and trust prove catastrophically wrong. David Kowalski hadn't been a suspicious outsider or obvious spender. He'd been woven into Portland's social fabric so seamlessly that his potential for violence had been invisible to everyone around him. Portland Public Schools immediately placed Kowalski on administrative leave, pending the criminal proceedings, launching their own internal investigation into his employment history and access to school facilities. Superintendent Patricia Morrison called an emergency meeting with principals throughout the district, reviewing safety protocols and attempting to address parent concerns about having a potential murderer working around their children. The investigation revealed disturbing patterns we'd missed. Morrison later admitted during a school board meeting, Kowalski had requested transfers to schools near Sandra's neighborhood multiple times. He'd volunteered for evening shifts that weren't required by his position. In retrospect, behaviors that seemed like dedication to his job take on much darker implications. The search of Kowalski's property yielded evidence that transformed the case from DNA identification to comprehensive criminal investigation. Beyond the newspaper clippings and detailed maps, investigators discovered a collection of photographs taken at various Murphy's Diner locations, images that appeared to have been shot covertly through windows, focusing on female employees, including several clear pictures of Sandra during her shifts. Detective Chen coordinated with the district attorney's office to build a case that would prove premeditation and first-degree murder charges. The evidence suggested that Kowalski had stalked Sandra for months before her disappearance, learning her schedule, her routes, and her habits, with the patience of a predator planning the perfect opportunity to strike. Ruth Martin learned of Kowalski's arrest through a phone call from Detective Chen, 15 years and 10 months after filing that first missing person report. "Mrs. Martin," Chen said gently, "we've made an arrest in Sandra's case. I'm coming over to explain everything in person." The drive to Ruth's house gave Chen time to prepare for one of the most difficult conversations in law enforcement. Explaining to a victim's family that their worst fears had been confirmed, while their desperate hopes for reunion had been definitively ended. Ruth opened her front door before Chen could knock, the porch light casting its familiar glow behind her as dawn broke over Portland. "Is she coming home?" Ruth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. When Chen shook her head, Ruth's composure finally cracked after 15 years of stubborn strength. The tears that followed represented not just grief for Sandra, but the collapse of hope that had sustained Ruth through nearly 2 decades of uncertainty. The press conference announcing Kowalski's arrest drew media attention from across the Pacific Northwest. Police Chief Michael Rodriguez faced a room full of cameras and reporters, eager for details about how genealogical DNA had finally solved one of Portland's most persistent cold cases. Sandra Martin was taken from her family and community by someone who lived among us, worked with us, and betrayed the trust we place in our neighbors every day, Rodriguez stated. While nothing can bring Sandra home, we hope that bringing her killer to justice provides some measure of closure for those who loved her. The revelation that Kowalski had been a regular customer at Murphy's Diner during Sandra's employment there sent shockwaves through the restaurant's current staff and former employees. Jenny Morrison, now the general manager, struggled to reconcile her memories of the quiet, cash-paying customer with the reality of what investigators alleged he'd done to her friend and colleague. He seemed so normal, Morrison told reporters outside the diner where Sandra had worked her final shift. Polite, never caused trouble, always cleaned up after himself. To think he was watching Sandra, planning, it makes everything feel contaminated. Every interaction, every conversation, every smile she gave him while she was serving his coffee. The community meetings that followed Kowalski's arrest revealed the psychological damage that Sandra's disappearance had inflicted on Southeast Portland residents. Parents admitted to years of heightened anxiety about their children's safety. Women described avoiding evening activities and always looking over their shoulders. The arrest provided answers but also confirmed that their fears had been justified. A predator had indeed been hunting in their neighborhood. Kowalski's defense attorney, Patricia Webb, acknowledged the DNA evidence while questioning the circumstantial nature of other aspects of the prosecution's case. Genetic evidence places my client in a public parking lot, where he was a known customer, she argued during preliminary hearings. The state will need to prove much more than DNA to establish what actually happened to Sandra Martin. The legal proceedings promised to be complex, with genealogical DNA evidence still relatively new in criminal courts and defense attorneys increasingly skilled at challenging its reliability and interpretation. But Detective Chen felt confident that the combination of genetic evidence, behavioral analysis, and physical evidence discovered during Kowalski's arrest would be sufficient to secure a conviction for Sandra's murder. As Portland processed the shock of learning that Sandra's killer had hidden among them for 15 years, the porch light at Ruth Martin's house finally served a different purpose. No longer a beacon calling Sandra home, it became a memorial flame honoring a daughter's memory and a mother's refusal to let her child's story end in silence and uncertainty. The Multnomah County Courthouse had rarely seen a case that generated as much community interest as the state of Oregon versus David Raymond Kowalski. By the time jury selection began in March 2023, the trial had become a focal point for discussions about forensic science, community safety, and the long journey from crime to justice that had spanned nearly 16 years of investigation and heartbreak. Prosecutor Michael Chen, no relation to Detective Sarah Chen, opened the state's case with Sandra's photograph displayed prominently for the jury, her radiant smile serving as a reminder of the life that had been stolen and the family that had endured decades of uncertainty. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the gravity of years of preparation, "this case is about betrayal of the most fundamental kind, the betrayal of community trust by someone who lived among us while harboring deadly intentions." The prosecution's presentation of genealogical DNA evidence required extensive expert testimony to help jurors understand how genetic material collected in 2007 could lead investigators directly to David Kowalski. Patricia Williams, the genetic genealogist, whose analysis had identified Kowalski as a suspect, spent 2 days explaining family tree construction, database analysis, and the mathematical probabilities that made her conclusions scientifically reliable. "The DNA evidence doesn't lie," Dr. Williams testified, addressing the jury directly. "Mr. Kowalski's genetic material was present at the scene of Sandra Martin's disappearance, and the genealogical analysis that led us to him represents the same scientific principles that help adopted children find their biological parents and solve paternity questions. The methodology is proven and reliable." Defense attorney Patricia Webb challenged the genealogical evidence on multiple fronts, arguing that the technique was too new to be considered scientifically established, and that the genetic databases used in the analysis contained inherent biases that could lead to false identifications. Her cross-examination of prosecution witnesses focused on the circumstantial nature of much of the evidence and the 15-year gap between Sandra's disappearance and Kowalski's arrest. "My client was a regular customer at Murphy's Diner," Webb argued during her opening statement. "His DNA in that parking lot proves nothing except what everyone already knew, that David Kowalski ate there frequently. The state's case relies on speculation, assumption, and guilt by association, rather than proof beyond a reasonable doubt of what actually happened to Sandra Martin." Ruth Martin's testimony proved to be the emotional centerpiece of the trial. After 15 years of advocacy, investigation, and unwavering hope, she finally had the opportunity to speak directly about Sandra's life, character, and the devastating impact of her disappearance on everyone who loved her. The courtroom fell silent as Ruth described the nightly vigil of keeping the porch light burning, the birthdays celebrated in Sandra's absence, and the gradual transformation from desperate hope to determined advocacy. Sandra was going to change the world, Ruth testified, her voice steady despite tears streaming down her face. She wanted to help people, to make a difference in her community. Instead, someone took that opportunity away from her, away from all of us. But Sandra's spirit lived on in the work I've done with other families, in the changes we've made to help find missing people faster. She's still helping people, even now. Jenny Morrison's testimony provided crucial context about Kowalski's behavior at Murphy's Diner during the months leading up to Sandra's disappearance. She described his unusual interest in Sandra's schedule, his request to sit in her section specifically, and his habit of lingering over coffee while watching Sandra work. "He paid attention to her in a way that made me uncomfortable," Morrison testified, "but Sandra was friendly with everyone. She didn't see the danger I was sensing." The prosecution's presentation of physical evidence, discovered during the search of Kowalski's property, proved devastating to his defense. The collection of newspaper clippings, detailed maps of Sandra's routes, and covert photographs of Murphy's Diner employees painted a picture of obsessive stalking behavior that extended far beyond casual customer interest. Expert testimony from behavioral analysts helped jurors understand how such evidence indicated premeditation and planning rather than spontaneous criminal action. Detective Sarah Chen's testimony traced the investigation from Sandra's disappearance through the technological breakthroughs that finally led to Kowalski's identification and arrest. Her detailed explanation of evidence preservation, cold case protocols, and the painstaking genealogical analysis that solved the case provided jurors with confidence in the investigation's thoroughness and reliability. This case demonstrates both the limitations of 2007 technology and the incredible advances that have revolutionized criminal investigation. Chen testified, evidence that couldn't provide answers 15 years ago became the key to solving Sandra's murder when analyzed with modern techniques. Science caught up with our need for justice. Kowalski's decision not to testify in his own defense surprised some court observers, but reflected his attorney's strategy of challenging the prosecution's evidence without risking damaging cross-examination. Throughout the trial, Kowalski maintained the same calm demeanor he'd displayed during his arrest, showing little emotion as witnesses described his alleged stalking behavior and the evidence linking him to Sandra's disappearance. The jury deliberation lasted 4 days, with extensive discussions about the genealogical DNA evidence and the circumstantial nature of proving murder without recovering Sandra's body. Juror interviews conducted after the trial revealed that the combination of genetic evidence, behavioral testimony, and physical evidence from Kowalski's property created a compelling case that overcame reasonable doubt about his guilt. The verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree, was announced on a gray April morning that seemed fitting for the conclusion of such a long and painful journey. Ruth Martin sat in the front row as the jury foreman read the decision, her hands clasped tightly around a photograph of Sandra that she'd carried to every court hearing. Judge Patricia Moore sentenced Kowalski to life in prison without the possibility of parole, noting that his betrayal of community trust and the premeditated nature of his crime warranted the harshest penalty available under Oregon law. Sandra Martin's life was taken by someone who exploited her kindness and betrayed the trust of everyone who knew him. Moore stated, "While nothing can restore what was lost, this sentence ensures that the defendant will never again have the opportunity to harm another innocent person." The community response to Kowalski's conviction mixed relief with ongoing trauma. Sandra's case had been solved, her killer identified and punished, but the revelation that such evil had hidden in plain sight for so many years left lasting scars on Portland's collective psyche. Support groups formed to help residents process the complex emotions surrounding the trial's conclusion and the community's long journey toward healing. Ruth Martin addressed reporters outside the courthouse after the sentencing, standing beneath the same gray sky that had witnessed Sandra's disappearance nearly 16 years earlier. "Justice has been served," she said, her voice carrying both satisfaction and exhaustion. "Sandra can finally rest, and I can finally turn off the porch light. But the work continues, helping other families, improving investigation techniques, making sure Sandra's story helps prevent other tragedies." The porch light at Ruth Martin's house went dark for the first time in 16 years on the evening of David Kowalski's sentencing. After nearly 6,000 nights of faithful vigil, the beacon that had called Sandra home through seasons of desperate hope and gradual acceptance finally completed its mission, not by guiding Sandra back to safety, but by witnessing justice finally delivered to the man who had stolen her future. Sandra Martin's story stands as testament to the transformative power of persistence, technology, and a mother's refusal to let her daughter's memory fade into statistical anonymity. The case that began with 2007's limited forensic capabilities concluded with 2023's revolutionary genetic analysis, proving that some questions will eventually find answers if we're patient enough to let science catch up with our need for truth. The genealogical DNA techniques that solved Sandra's case have since been applied to hundreds of cold cases across the United States, giving new hope to families who had accepted that their loved ones' disappearances would remain forever mysterious. Ruth Martin's advocacy work through Sandra's Light Foundation helped establish protocols and funding streams that made such advanced analysis available to law enforcement agencies previously unable to afford cutting-edge forensic services. Detective Sarah Chen retired from the Portland Police Bureau 6 months after Kowalski's conviction, her career culminating with the solution of a case that had defined her approach to cold case investigation. "Sandra's case taught me that persistence and technology can overcome almost any obstacle," Chen reflected. "But it also reminded me that justice delayed isn't necessarily justice denied. Sometimes we just have to wait for the tools to catch up with our determination." The betrayal represented by David Kowalski's crimes, a trusted community member who exploited that trust to stalk and kill Sandra Martin, forced Portland to confront uncomfortable truths about personal safety and community vigilance. The revelation that evil can wear familiar faces and perform helpful deeds while harboring deadly intentions became a sobering lesson for residents who had previously felt secure in their assumptions about neighborhood safety. Murphy's Diner, where Sandra worked her final shift, became an unexpected memorial to both her memory and the broader lessons of her case. A small plaque near the entrance honors Sandra's life while reminding customers about the importance of community awareness and personal safety. The diner's staff receives annual training about recognizing concerning behavior and supporting law enforcement investigations. Protocols developed directly from the mistakes and oversights that initially allowed Kowalski's obsession with Sandra to go undetected. The legal precedents, established during Kowalski's trial, helped solidify genealogical DNA analysis as a legitimate and reliable forensic technique, paving the way for its broader application in criminal justice systems nationwide. Defense challenges to the methodology were systematically addressed and overcome, creating legal frameworks that will benefit future prosecutions relying on similar genetic evidence. Ruth Martin's transformation from grieving mother to national advocate demonstrates how personal tragedy can catalyze broader social change. Sandra's Law, the missing person legislation Ruth championed in Oregon, has been adopted by 12 other states and continues to improve response times and coordination protocols when people disappear. The Sandra's Light Foundation has assisted over 300 families facing similar crises, providing both practical support and emotional guidance drawn from Ruth's hard-won experience. Perhaps most significantly, Sandra's case illustrates that modern technology can breathe new life into old evidence, offering hope to the thousands of families whose loved ones disappeared before today's forensic capabilities existed. DNA samples collected decades ago and stored in evidence rooms across the country represent potential solutions to cases that seemed permanently unsolvable, if investigators remain committed to periodic re-examination using evolving scientific techniques. The community healing process that followed Kowalski's conviction required acknowledgement that perfect safety remains impossible, but that vigilance, compassion, and technological advancement can substantially improve our ability to protect each other and achieve justice when protection fails. Sandra Martin's story reminds us that every missing person represents someone's daughter, son, parent, or friend, real people with dreams, ambitions, and communities that love them. As Portland moves forward from this long chapter of uncertainty and pain, Sandra's memory lives on in the improved protocols, enhanced awareness, and strengthened community bonds that emerged from tragedy. The porch light may be extinguished, but the illumination it represented, hope, persistence, and unwavering love, continues to guide families and investigators, working to ensure that Sandra Martin's story represents not just justice achieved, but prevention accomplished for future potential victims who will remain safe because of lessons learned in her name.